Hi, I'm Zeke with the Eastside Church of Christ in Baytown, Texas. Thanks for joining us as we continue our study in the Gospel of Mark. In our last lessons, we had looked at a lengthy section of teaching that Jesus does, in which we looked at four parables, one of which is his maybe most famous of all, the parable of the sower and the seed. But of the four that we looked at, there were three that were agricultural in nature, had to do with seed in various ways. And they're powerful parables because they are not only explanatory of things that are commonplace, which everybody in every age and every place knows about, but they're deep and profound in what they teach with those simple subjects. Well, Mark is going to go on from showing Jesus' power in teaching to showing Jesus' power in other ways. We're going to see Jesus' mighty power in at least four different ways in today's study. We're going to see his power over nature. We're going to see his power over demons, his power over disease, and finally his power over death. Jesus is going to do something that we've seen. If you've read other Gospels, you've seen where Jesus does this. He stills the storm. We're going to talk about that in just a moment. But what this does is it shows us how he has absolute power over everything. In Mark chapter 4, let's just go ahead and read the episode. In Mark 4 and in verse 35, we read that on that day when evening came, he said to them, "Let us go over to the other side." And leaving the crowd, they took him along with them in the boat, just as he was, and other boats were with him. And there arose a fierce gale of wind, and the waves were breaking up over the boat so much that the boat was already filling up. And Jesus himself was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" He got up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Hush, be still." And the wind died down, and it became perfectly calm. And he said to them, "Why are you afraid? How is it that you have no faith?" And they became very much afraid and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" Now, this is the first of three boat stories in the Gospel of Mark. The other two occur in chapter 6 and in chapter 8. And these stories become important teaching moments for the disciples. Now, when we think about Jesus' power over the waves, throughout the Old Testament, tells us that God is the one who controls nature. God is the one who calms the sea, who controls the waves. For example, in the very beginning of the Bible, Genesis chapter 1, God takes a world that is water and forms it and shapes it to be an inhabitable place for his human creation, for his animal creation as well, certainly. Psalm 89 verse 9 puts it this way. It says, "You rule the raging of the sea. When its waves rise, you still them." Psalm 107 verse 29 says this, "He made the storm be still, and the waves of the sea were hushed." Now, Jesus' disciples were Jews, and they certainly, probably at some point, had read through those Psalms. And to the Jewish mind, again, only God could control the sea. So this episode has a lot going for it that just impacts the disciples concerning Jesus' very identity. The Sea of Galilee, on which this storm takes place, lies about 700 feet below sea level, and it's ringed with high hills, and winds would come down and rush in because of the steep valleys that are around it, and storms could come up very quickly with no warning at all. And even though these men, at least some of them in the episode that we're looking at, are experienced fishermen, I mean, they've been fishing in these waters for years, still they can appreciate the power of a sudden storm. So for a moment, let's just look at the problem that causes the panic. In verses 37 and 38, we read about this fierce gale of wind and the waves that were so violent that they were breaking over the ship. They were It was a storm. And as it gets worse and worse, the disciples begin to fear for their lives. In fact, so much so that they cry out to Jesus in verse 38, "Don't you care that we're perishing?" These are men who had been, no doubt, in storms like these before. And yet now they're fearing for their lives. In fact, for them to yell out like they do in panic to Jesus, the storm must have been pretty severe indeed. Jesus, though, apparently exhausted after all that we've already seen him do and teach, is asleep on a cushion. And they take that apparently for indifference when they ask him, "Don't you care that we're perishing?" But Jesus is not just a passenger on this boat. Jesus is a passenger with a plan. In verses 39 through 40, Jesus awakes. And verse 39 says that he rebukes the wind. That word rebuke means to admonish or to put one in one's place. So let's think about this for a moment. He rebukes the wind. He says, "Hush, be still." And the wind died down and it became perfectly calm. He put the wind in its place. Like the wind, our place is simply to be subject to the one who created us. The wind is not an animate object, but the Lord created it, and it is subject to him. Now we are animate creatures. We are creatures with not only a mind to think with and bodies to work with, but also wills to direct. And our will should be directed to being subject to the one who created us. Jesus is creator, John 1 tells us. And not only that, but Colossians 1:17 says that he holds all things together by the power of his word. Further, in 1 Corinthians 8 verse 6, we're told that all things exist for him. In other words, all things exist in subject to him. And so we should recognize our place as we read about the stilling of the storm. Now, upon hearing the command, right? I say hearing the command, wind can't hear, but upon Jesus' utterance of this command, "Hush, be still," the wind dies down and it becomes not just less calm, but perfectly calm. A calm sea. One minute there was a raging storm, the next minute stillness and calm. And peace is exactly what Jesus wanted his disciples to understand and to realize. He tells them about the priority that produces peace. In verse 40, he asks them, "Why were you afraid?" In other words, where's your peace? How is it that you have no faith? Now, as I said before, these boat moments are teachable moments. There are times for the disciples to assess themselves in perspective and in light of the one whom they're with. And so when Jesus asks them, why do they have no faith? He wants them to realize who it is that they're with. In Matthew, in the same episode that Matthew recounts for us, they're rebuked for having little faith. Here, Jesus says they have no faith. How is it that you have no faith? In each gospel, not only is the disciples' lack of faith mentioned, but also their fear. In this episode where it appears in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all three synoptic gospels included. And it's plain to see that Jesus is attributing this lack of faith to fear. But consider what Jesus said at the very beginning of this. In verse 35, he said, "Let's go to the other side." Now, Jesus didn't say, "Let's go out and lose our lives in a storm." When he said, "Let's go to the other side," implied in there is the promise that they're going to get to the other side. And the command to go is also the promise that, or at least the implication, that it can be achieved, that it can be accomplished. Let's go to the other side, Jesus says. And with Jesus' help, they finally do. Verse 41 says that they became very much afraid. And they said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" Of course, the question, or at least the answer to the question, ought to be clear. This is no less than the Son of God, God himself in human flesh. Jesus has shown his power over nature, and next he'll show his power over demons. In verse 1 of chapter 5, it says, "Then they came to the other side of the sea." Remember, that's what Jesus said, let's go to the other side. Verse 1 says, "Then they came to the other side, into the country of the Gerasenes." So they had gone from this area of Capernaum, and now they're over in this area here. And now Jesus' power is about to be revealed in a new way. He's calmed the storm, and he's healed people before, but now he's going to show us how different people come falling at Jesus' feet, each of them with a severe problem. And just as he calmed the waves and the wind at the end of chapter 4, so now he's going to calm the roiling emotions that are going on inside three very different people. First, let's read about a man who is in a pitiful state as Jesus shows his power over demons. First, let's recognize the pitiful misery that this man is in. In verse 2 of chapter 5, it says, "When he got out of the boat, immediately a man from the tombs with an unclean spirit met him. And he had his dwelling among the tombs, and no one was able to bind him any more, even with a chain, because he had often been bound with shackles and chains. And the chains had been torn apart by him, and the shackles broken in pieces. And no one was strong enough to subdue him. Constantly, night and day, he was screaming among the tombs and in the mountains, and gashing himself with stones." Man, this poor man's pathetic condition is portrayed to us in very vivid terms. This guy lived among the dead. He lived among the tombs. Talk about quiet neighbors. But think about it. Maybe this is a place where he thought he could find some peace for himself. And there was no peace for this man. We read about his dangerously violent tendencies here. He had been bound with shackles, and those shackles and chains were torn apart by him. There was no one strong enough, it says, to subdue him. This is a guy who is in such a struggle with the forces that are at work within him that it shows itself in the things that he does, the violent ways in which he tries to maybe try and achieve some kind of peace in his life. This poor man was a terror to others and a torment to himself. Look at verse 5. "Constantly, night and day, he was screaming among the tombs and in the mountains." Can you imagine hearing that in a nearby village? Hearing the howls and the wails of this poor man as he wrestles with these forces that are at war within him. It says he was gashing himself with stones. Who knows why he did that? Who knows why people choose to hurt themselves? Apparently this man thought that it was some way to bring some kind of resolution to the turmoil that he was in. All in all, it's a pretty pitiful misery that he found himself in. But then he comes face to face with the authority of the master. In verse 6, we read that, "Seeing Jesus from a distance, he ran up and bowed down before him, and shouting with a loud voice, he said, 'What business do we have with each other, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I implore you by God, do not torment me.' For he had been saying to him, 'Come out of the man, you unclean spirit.' And he was asking him, 'What is your name?' And he said to him, 'My name is Legion, for we are many.' And he began to implore him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now there was a large herd of swine feeding nearby on the mountain. The demons implored him, saying, 'Send us into the swine so that we may enter them.' And Jesus gave them permission, and coming out, The unclean spirits entered the swine, and the herd rushed down the steep bank into the sea, about 2,000 of them, and they were drowned in the sea. We'll stop there. Notice how the demons plead for mercy. They recognize who Jesus is. And there's some back and forth here between the man and Jesus, between Jesus and the demons. There's this talk going on. It's almost as though the man and the demons were one, but yet the man is trying to find some way to overcome, to get them out of him. And these demons, well, first of all, notice the man. In verse 6, it says he ran up and bowed down to him. That's a word that we've seen before. It's a word that's used often in worship when someone comes down and they prostrate themselves in a worship. This man does that. He runs up and he prostrates himself before Jesus. He bows down before him. Part of the reason is maybe because the demons recognize who Jesus is. They know who he is. In fact, James tells us in James chapter 2, verse 19, that the demons believe and tremble. They know what their final end is going to be. And here they plead with Jesus, don't send us into the abyss. They want to go into some other living creature. They want to go to this large number of pigs, 2,000 pigs. And some have speculated that maybe that's how many unclean spirits there were in this legion of demons. I don't know if you can prove that or not, but at the very least, if there were enough to inhabit all those pigs, no wonder this poor man was beside himself with trouble and anguish. But notice how, as the demons plead, the master commands. We read in verse 12 that they begged Jesus to send us into the swine that we may enter them, and Jesus gave them permission. Now before it told us that he was saying, come out of the man, in verse 8, you unclean spirit. Well, now they do. And they rush into a herd of pigs who themselves run down an embankment and are drowned in the sea. But that's all it takes. One word from Jesus, go! And they're gone. They obey, knowing that they cannot refuse him. The demons flee into this herd of swine, and the swine are apparently driven mad by the infestation, flee themselves headlong into the sea. Before they had pleaded with Jesus, don't send us back, don't send us into the abyss. I wonder where they ended up after the pigs drowned themselves. Probably the abyss, I would think. But look at the misconception of the unbelieving crowd who witnessed this thing. In verse 14 it said, their herdsmen, the keepers of the pigs, ran away and reported it in the city and in the country. And the people came to see what it was that had happened. They came to Jesus and observed the man who had been demon-possessed sitting down, clothed and in his right mind, the very man who had the legion, and they became frightened. Those who had seen it described to them how it had happened to the demon-possessed man and all about the swine, and they began to implore him to leave their region. So the event triggers a quick reaction from the people, but their reaction reveals their spiritual condition. Although the man was clothed and now in his right mind, these people became very much afraid. And so they asked Jesus to leave. They implore him, they beg him to go away. Maybe it was because of the heightened uncertainty that they must have felt. After all, who does this kind of thing? Or maybe it was the loss, the bare financial loss of all those pigs. Who knows? Whatever it was, they obviously seemed to prefer swine to the Savior. They preferred pigs to the Prince of Peace. And I wonder how many today have worldly interests that work against their better spiritual interests. Whatever people's fear, whatever apprehension they may have at losing whatever it is they think they have, that fear or apprehension grows so great that they never respond to their spiritual need. Like these in the story that we're reading, they implore Jesus to leave, and so Jesus obliges them. He leaves. And if we beg Jesus to leave, if we just refuse him, well, he's not going to force himself upon anyone. If what some want for him to do is to leave, that's exactly what Jesus is going to do. He's going to leave. But I want you to notice, we're not done with the story yet. We've seen the reaction of the unbelieving people. Notice the ministry of the believer. In verse 18, it says that as he was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed was imploring him that he might accompany him. And he did not let him. But he said to him, "Go home to your people and report to them what great things the Lord has done for you, and how he had mercy on you." And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis what great things Jesus had done for him. And everyone was amazed. Well, this newly delivered man wants to go with Jesus. That's understandable. I mean, maybe he thought that if I don't go with this one who took them away from me, maybe they're going to come back. Maybe he felt that he needed to be close to Jesus in order to have that protection. Man, there's a lesson there, isn't there? Stay close to Jesus for protection. But Jesus refuses him. He says, no, instead, I want you to go and tell people. Now, at other times in Mark chapter 1 and Mark chapter 4, Jesus had told people whom he had helped not to say anything. But here, in this Gentile region, he says, go and tell everyone in the Decapolis what is going on. And that's exactly what he does in verse 20. He began to proclaim in the Decapolis. The Decapolis is a word that means 10 cities, and it was a conglomeration of cities that were under Roman rule, but yet were allowed to have some self-rule. They were Gentile cities. And this man goes and he tells everybody what Jesus did for him. I wonder if that had any impact on the people who once used to know him as being uncontrolled, as being uncontrollable. I think it did. The next time we see Jesus come back to this area in Mark chapter 7, there are people who were waiting for him, people who were coming to him. What an opportunity this man had, living in a largely Gentile area where he had the opportunity to prepare a great harvest for Christianity. To go and tell everybody what Jesus had done for him. And isn't that what we're supposed to do? Tell people what Jesus has done for us. But he says in verse 19, what great things the Lord has done for you, and how he had mercy on you. Oh, how much do we need to do that today? Jesus continues to show his power. Now he's going to show his power over disease and death in 2 episodes that form another one of Mark's famous sandwiches. In verses 21 through 24, we have a man named Jairus who approaches him with a request to come and heal his sick daughter. And then Mark inserts a healing story of a woman who had a hemorrhage, a bleeding disorder for some 12 years. And then in verse 35, we go back to the story of Jairus, which has a very satisfactory ending. Let's talk about it for a moment, though. But before we do that, I want you to notice something. When we were in chapter 4, verse 35 said, Jesus said to his disciples, let's go to the other side. And it is the beginning of a series of crossings to and from the western side of the Sea of Galilee to the eastern side. The western side is mostly Jewish. The eastern side is mostly Gentile. And we see Jesus constantly crossing. In fact, here's a list of some of those crossings in the Gospel of Mark. He goes from east to west to east to west to east to west, constantly crisscrossing the lake from Jewish to Gentile, from Jewish to Gentile, and back and forth. And it's almost as though Jesus is threading back and forth between the two. And I can't help but think about what Paul says in Ephesians chapter 2, where he reminds us that in Jesus, two that were once apart become one new man in Christ. Now, I don't know if that's exactly what Jesus is doing here, but it seems to me that there's some symbolism, some symbolic knitting together of Jew and Gentile. Well, let's talk about, first of all, Jesus' power over disease. We see at the very beginning of this episode that Jairus approaches Jesus. In verse 22 it says, one of the synagogue officials named Jairus came up and on seeing him fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, my little daughter is at the point of death. Please come and lay your hands on her so that she will get well and live. And he went off with him, and a large crowd was following him and pressing in on him. Now, let's just notice what's going on here. Jesus already has been blacklisted by the religious people of the day. And yet, Jairus here is a man of some importance. He's a synagogue official. Surely he knew what the religious leadership, what the Jewish leadership was saying about Jesus, how he was a blasphemer and a heretic. But yet we see a man at the end of his rope who puts all that aside, and being not too proud to beg, he comes and he throws himself at Jesus' feet. Now, probably he doesn't bow down and worship. He's falling down before Jesus because he's begging. He's begging for help. But Jesus is delayed en route to Jairus' house. Let's read verse 25. It says, a woman who had a hemorrhage for 12 years and had endured much at the hands of many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was not helped at all, but rather had grown worse, upon hearing about Jesus, she came up in the crowd behind him and touched his cloak. For she thought, if I just touch his garments, I'll get well. Immediately, the flow of her blood had dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her affliction. And we'll stop there for just a moment. I want you to think about the miserable condition of this woman. We had looked at the pathetic condition of the demon-possessed man earlier in this chapter. Think about the condition of this woman. A woman who had endured bleeding for some 12 years. Incidentally, interestingly, we find later on that Jairus' daughter is 12 years old. For the entire lifetime of Jairus' daughter, this woman had been dealing with a frustrating issue of bleeding. And it was so much so that all the money that she had spent, and it was all of her money, didn't make anything better. In fact, she had been made worse for it. But that's not the worst of it. Under Moses' law, this kind of discharge of blood not only made a woman unclean, but anything and anyone that came in contact with her. Now, of course, that periodic bleeding eventually stops, and then a woman can go through a ritualistic ceremony and be clean again till the next time. Well, this woman, her trouble never stopped. She should not have even been in the crowd, much less reaching out to touch the Lord's garment. And yet, being as deeply troubled as she was, being in the throes of this illness and having the stigma of this uncleanness, being effectively cut off from the worship of God and the fellowship of his people, her desperation is evident, and it's shown by the fact that she's reaching, in spite of the fact that all the other cures that were attempted were no-goes. They didn't help her one bit. Yet in faith, she reaches out and she touches Jesus' garment. Now, obviously, she's hoping not to attract any attention. She says, if I just touch it, I'll get well. And she does. She reaches out and she touches Jesus' garment, and she said, and it says that immediately in verse 29, the flow of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her affliction. I don't think words could really adequately describe what this woman was going through, the range of emotions that she must have felt when she realized, finally, 12 years, I'm cured. Notice the assurance that Jesus gives to her. In verse 30, it says, immediately Jesus, perceiving in himself that the power proceeding from him had gone forth, turned around in the crowd and said, who touched my garments? And his disciples said to him, you see the crowd pressing in on you, and you say, who touched me? And he looked around to see the woman who had done this. But the woman, fearing and trembling, aware of what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction. Jesus immediately perceived the touch and was able to distinguish it from the merely curious groping that must have been going on. Everybody's touching him. Everybody wants to touch the miracle man. Well, this woman had a different kind of touch. She touched him in faith. And when Jesus asked, who did this? She owns up to it, but she's afraid. She's trembling and afraid. And she responds by declaring her intention. Maybe she told him, I thought that if I just touched your garment, that I would be healed. And then she tells him that she is healed. Verse 33 says that she told him the whole truth. And Jesus commends her. And he makes this healing official by saying, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction. I want you to notice something here. In this sandwich of Luke's, there's also a link to the rest of the sandwich. Jesus was on his way to heal the daughter of a prominent man. And here he heals another daughter, a poor, sick woman. But they were both daughters. And they were both, well, one of them has been healed so far. The other one will be too. Let's see now Jesus' power over death. As we continue in Mark's sandwich, it says in verse 35 that while he was still speaking, they came from the house of the synagogue official saying, your daughter has died. Why trouble the teacher anymore? Now, think about what Jairus might have been thinking at that point. They were on their way to Jairus' place so that Jesus could deal with the sick daughter. Well, now she's no longer sick, she's dead. And maybe Jairus was thinking, oh, if this other woman hadn't interrupted us, maybe we'd have been there by now, been able to do something about this. But I want you to notice how Jesus reassures him. Verse 36 says, but Jesus, overhearing what was spoken, said to the synagogue official, do not be afraid any longer, only believe. Now, after Jairus is given the sad news that his daughter has passed away, he was already willing to believe the difficult before this. He was willing to believe that Jesus could perform a miracle, that he could heal his sick daughter. I mean, after all, he gave up his pride in order to beg Jesus to come and do that very thing. But was he now willing to believe not just the difficult, but for everything he knew was impossible? After all, who comes back from the dead? And this is exactly what Jesus asks him to do. Verse 36, don't be afraid any longer. Just believe. In spite of all that might have been going through his head, in spite of the news that he had gotten, he hangs on. He grasps on to this little bit of reassurance that Jesus gives to him. In verse 37, it says, he allowed no one to accompany him, except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. And they came to the house of the synagogue official, and he saw a commotion, the people loudly weeping and wailing. And entering in, he said to them, why make a commotion and weep? The child has not died, but is asleep. In verse 40, it says they began laughing at him. But putting them all out, he took along the child's father and mother and his own companions and entered into the room where the child was. Now stop there for just a moment. I want you to notice the ridicule that Jesus goes through. He gets there, right? And Jairus, poor guy, is hanging on to the last thread of hope that he has. And he gets there, and there are mourners all around there. And Jesus says, what are you making all this hoopla for? She's not dead. She's asleep. And really, for practical purposes, she is. We're going to see her rise from the dead in a moment. But they didn't know that. All they knew was that she was dead. And they began laughing at him. The very idea, they must have thought. Well, Jesus separates those and brings in with him just Peter, James, and John. Or rather, it tells us in verse 40, he took along the child's father and mother and his own companions, Peter, James, and John. And they went into the room where the child was. Notice the revival that takes place in verse 41. Taking the child by the hand, he said to her, Talitha cum, which translated means, little girl, I say to you, get up. And immediately the girl got up and began to walk, for she was 12 years old. And immediately they were completely astounded. And he gave them strict orders that no one should know about this. And he gave them, and he said that something should be given her to eat. Now, Peter, James, and John had already been separated from the rest to go with Jesus to Jairus' house. And now Jesus makes a further separation. He takes Peter, James, and John and the child's parents into the room with her. Can you imagine, as they looked upon their poor dead daughter, what must have been going through their minds? Can Jesus really do something with this? And Jesus takes this little girl by the hand, which itself was a violation of Jewish law. I mean, after all, you weren't supposed to touch a dead person or else you become unclean. But no matter, because she wouldn't be dead for much longer anyway. Like Jesus says, she's just asleep. Understandably, the parents were completely astounded. And when Jesus takes this little girl by the hand, he raises her up and he says those few words, Talitha cum, and Mark gives us the translation. Get up, little girl. Probably the same kind of words that any parent would say to their daughter as she slept in the morning. Get up, little girl. Well, the little girl got up. And finally, as another beautiful practical touch that brings them back into the normalcy of everyday life, Jesus says, get her something to eat. Maybe her sickness had somehow emaciated her for whatever reason. Jesus gives them a touch of normalcy. Give her something to eat. Now, he also instructs them in verse 43 that they tell no one about this. But of course, I'm sure that that's the kind of thing that you can't keep secret. After all, when this little girl walks out of that room later on, not just to the astonishment, surprise of the people who were there, no doubt they would have gone out and told everyone about what had occurred at Jairus' house. There's a lesson here. Death is man's great problem. But Jesus came, Hebrews chapter 2 tells us, to conquer death for us by himself experiencing death. And so we can know that what Jesus did for this little girl, he'll do for us someday when we hear his voice. And John chapter 5 says that even those who were in the tombs will hear and will rise. We've seen how Jesus has power over all. It's been proven and confirmed. It's been witnessed by those who needed that power most of all. He has power over what unrest rules in your life, just as he had power over the demons that were terrorizing that poor man among the tombs. He has power over those demons that torment you and cause you unrest, like the roiling waves in which he calmed and stilled. He has power over the soul sickness that no one else can heal, and all that we do makes it worse, like that woman who had the hemorrhage. And he has power over the separation from God that death is, that he came to eradicate, that he came to give ultimate healing for, because Jesus has power over all. Well, thanks for joining us today as we considered these separate miracles, these 4 separate miracles. Just as we had looked previously at 4 separate parables, now we've seen 4 separate miracles of Jesus, all proving conclusively the power of the Mighty One. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time. God bless you.